writer and a graphic artist and a speaker from the former USSR, and he's the author of Shakedown Socialism, of which David Horowitz said, "I hope everyone reads this book." In 1994, he moved to the U.S. with the hope of living in a country ruled by reason and common sense, appreciative of its freedoms and prosperity. To his dismay, he discovered a nation deeply infected by the leftist disease of progressivism that was arresting true societal progress. American movies, TV, and news media reminded him of his former occupation as a visual propaganda artist for the Communist Party, a job he reluctantly held, as he knew that no intelligent person would take such art by numbers agitprop seriously. So with that, let's have Oleg come up and tell us about his experiences.
I grew up in the Soviet Union, and as all Soviet children, I believed what the teachers told us. The parents sometimes believed in that communist idea, or sometimes they didn't, but even if they didn't, they wouldn't tell us, because they wouldn't want us to get into trouble. So we all believed that we were living in the best country in the world, and while the rest of the world was suffering under this unfair capitalist oppression. And the worst, of course, was the United States. It was like the most oppressed country, where the people were suffering the most unfair. And of course, we all wanted the rest of the world to be more like us, living in a socialist society, building communism. And we all couldn't wait to start living in communism, because we were promised that we would live in this fairy tale world when we grow up, with no money, no hard work. Everything would be taken care for us, and it was like extended childhood, so what's not to like? And eventually, when we grew up a little, all of us started questioning the system, and we saw the absurdities that were going around, the corruption, the lies, the hypocrisy of the society. And like many others, at first I attributed all that to the improper implementation of the Marxist idea. That it was, the idea was good, it's just that there were fools at the high levels of the government, or maybe the middle level, that were ruining it for us. And of course, the top levels of the government were blaming the middle level all the time. And because whenever something goes wrong, something breaks, something doesn't work, it's the middle level, the bureaucrats, who are to blame. So the war on bureaucracy started in the Soviet Union right away from the inception and continued all the way until it disintegrated. They were fighting the bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats were hated by the people from above, from below, and they were chastised by the officials from above, but it was all a game, because bureaucrats are always inefficient, they're always corrupt. The problem is to just reduce the number of bureaucrats so that they wouldn't interfere and stand in our way. And that leads to the idea of limited government. And eventually I began to realize that it wasn't the Marxism was not the solution to all the problems, but it was the problem itself, that we needed to get rid of that. Unfortunately, a lot of dissidents in the former USSR were of the variety that thought that a different version of socialism would have helped, that the Stalinist version was bad, it was incorrect, it was a perversion, but it wasn't a perversion. The more I began to realize what was going on, I realized that the way that socialism developed in the USSR was the only possible way of maintaining a working economy. Because when the material incentives didn't exist, the only way to make people work was through, on the one hand, moral incentives and agitation and propaganda, on the other hand, through terror and intimidation. And eventually, as I describe in my book Shakedown Socialism, what happened is that the government, the Soviet government, dismantled all the workers' rights and all the labor laws and turned the workers into virtual slaves. And the people, starting with late 20s and early 30s, were unable to leave their work, were unable to change the job on their own will. The government decided centrally how much everybody would be paid. When the unions helped the communists to come to power, just like they're doing it here in the United States, all the unions were on the side of the communists. They were promoting their ideas, spreading the propaganda, assisting the revolution in all possible ways. They were hoping that the government would take over some of the union functions, and that would make the life of the workers better. The problem here is that when the government takes over any organization's functions, that organization becomes redundant and in competition with the government. And nobody can survive a competition with the government, because the government always wins. So what happened in the Soviet Union was that the unions became redundant, they were subdued by the government, and they were eventually absorbed into the Department of Labor and became just a voiceless puppet. And nobody was left to protect the workers' rights, as the unions were originally created to do. So the workers became powerless. And that is the danger with the unions in the United States. The more power they get, the more power they transfer to the government, the more they influence the political process here, the worse it is for the workers. And the workers are already suffering from all the layoffs, because when the union price out some entire industries out of existence, then it's the workers who suffer. But when the government takes over more of the union functions, which it already has, like OSHA, for instance, and a few other state and federal regulations that are now duplicating what the unions were supposed to do, the less the unions will be able to have a say in any development. And as it happened in the USSR, eventually when industries are absorbed by the states, then whenever there is a conflict between a worker and the employer, it's already not between the private employer and the worker, it's between the worker and the government. And so if you have a misdemeanor, if you skip a day of work, if you are late for work, that becomes a crime against the state. And then you're punished. And under Stalin, people were jailed for being late for work, for not coming to work. For a farmer could be jailed. There were cases when a child was grabbing a few stalks of grain from a field in the village, and he was arrested for stealing people's property, because all grain was collectivized. It was supposed to be the people's property. But then again, when everything is everybody's, then it's nobody's just as well. So theft was prominent. That's why the terror under Stalin was trying to curb that theft of collective property. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev liberalized the country a little bit, and the workers gained more rights again, more rights than they could ever dream about. And then what happened is that still without not having material incentives to work, they just stopped trying, and they just worked as long as, so that to lay the bosses off their backs, but they weren't trying. The joke was of the time that if they pretend that they're paying us, and we'll pretend that we're working. I describe this and more, again, in my book, the whole process that leads to the corruption of the society and disintegration of the morals, of the ethics, of the attitudes. Even now, years later, after the Communist Party has been dismantled in the USSR, the former Soviet republics are still unable to come back to normalcy, because, and that's what I was hoping would become when the Ukraine, where I lived, became independent. I was hoping it would become like another Western European country pretty soon, because we had a pretty large urban population with educated workforce. We had a lot of industries, we had a lot of natural resources, and more or less homogeneous population. What was stopping us to become like another European country? That didn't happen because what I didn't realize is that socialism corrupts people so deeply that a few generations must grow without knowing how to live under socialism before they can start living in a normal society again and having normal work ethics and general relationship between people or in the workplace environment. And what I mean is that when for a while I worked as a guided translator for American business people coming to Ukraine, and I traveled with them throughout the country in Ukraine and Russia, helping them to find out how to set up businesses, because they imagined that the former USSR would be like the new Wild West. Whoever comes first becomes the richest and grabs everything. That didn't work out that way for most of them, because every time they tried to set up something, a bureaucrat was there who demanded either a bribe or direct bribe, or to employ a certain relative in a certain no-show position, or any other way of corrupt way of setting up business, some kind of kickback, a payoff. And sometimes those prices and their ideas of how much the Americans can pay were very unrealistic. So again, I expand on that more in my book, and I just don't have much time. I have to kind of keep my pace up. I mentioned one joke already about they pretend they're paying us and we pretend we're working, but there were a lot more, and I think jokes were the thing that helped to bring down this the rule of the Communist Party, because humor, you cannot argue with humor, you cannot argue with satire. It's a very powerful tool. And when people were telling political jokes, no number of KGB agents listening in could stop that. People would always tell jokes, and there is no way of fighting that. So I knew many of them. And when I came to the States in 1994, when I was 34 years old, I was telling my new American friends old Soviet jokes, but oftentimes they didn't understand why that was supposed to be funny. And that was because I realized eventually, not so much because of language differences, but because of the socio-political context. They just didn't know what those jokes were about, because they were not familiar with the media double standards, with the necessity to read between the lines whenever a politician speaks, with this politically correct attitude. I mean, that was already present in the United States, but it wasn't still the standard. But now I notice the more this country progresses towards this great utopia that Obama is leading us to, the more translatable the Soviet jokes become. And now Americans begin to understand them, because they know what they're about now. They didn't know. And I noticed this, the process of change, that Obama promised us change, and the change is happening. And I noticed that the more I live, the more I can document these changes that America is going through, how it's becoming more like the USSR. And even the jokes are becoming more translatable. So one of my favorite jokes was the one called the 6 Contradictions of Socialism in the USSR. And it goes like this. Contradiction number 1. There is no unemployment, and yet no one is working. Number 2. No one is working, and yet all production quotas are fulfilled. The production quotas are fulfilled, yet the stores have nothing to sell. The shelves are empty. The shelves are empty, and yet people have all the stuff at home. People have all the stuff at home, and yet no one is happy. No one is happy with the situation, and yet the voting is always unanimous. So that's the 6 contradictions of socialism. Now, having lived in this country for a while, I decided that it was time to write a joke about the 6 contradictions of socialism in the United States of America. It goes like this. America is capitalistic and greedy, and yet half of the population is subsidized. Half of the population is subsidized, and yet they think they're victims. They think they're victims, and yet their representatives run the government. The representatives run the government, and yet the poor keep getting poorer. The poor keep getting poorer, and yet they have all the stuff that people in other countries can only dream about. They have all the stuff that people in other countries can only dream about, and yet they want America to be more like those other countries. So, speaking of the changes that are happening, when I first came here, I, of course, didn't realize what was going on. I came to New York because I thought it would be easier to find work there for an immigrant. There was a large Russian-speaking community, and I only had a tourist visa, so I needed some way to. Unfortunately, the immigration. I wanted to become an American citizen for the longest time. Unfortunately, the immigration system here is set up in a way that is. It's easier for the Tsarnaev brothers and his family to become immigrants and receive all the benefits from the government than for people like me and many others that I know who cannot get legal status in any other way. There are just no opportunities for us. And so I had to go through a very difficult immigration process before I became legalized. And at some point even I didn't have legal paperwork. So it's not, this whole debate about illegal immigration is sometimes skewed because the left frames the debate in terms legals versus illegals. It's not that, it's the people who are useful for this country, who want to be Americans but have no legal way of becoming them. And then there are people who shouldn't be here, who will never assimilate, never become Americans. And they are getting the green light and all the welfare benefits that come with the refugee status. Because whenever somebody gets a refugee status, they have subsidized housing, they have education grants, welfare benefits, free medical care, and so on. Anyway, going back to the changes. First, yes, I lived in New York, and it was a big liberal bubble. And I didn't know what was really going on because the only news I was getting was from the media, from the New York Public Radio, from the New York Times, Time Magazine, all the people around me that I worked with. It was all regurgitated opinions that were bouncing off the wall of the liberal bubble and back to the people. And I only heard that there were some conservatives, some were living in the backwoods, like a dying breed. We shouldn't even worry about them, they will soon disappear, they're just a nuisance. That's what my impression was. Then, but I still was trying to find out. I came here as a strong opponent of communism and socialism. I just didn't see anybody around me who was a fan of capitalism in New York. When I was talking to people, I would notice that one of the things I didn't expect to find in America was the desire to count other people's money, because that was something very typical of socialism. In the USSR, it was an obligation of a citizen to watch over another one's shoulder and see how much he's getting and how much everybody has. Because in that system, when corruption was very easy to perpetrate, the government-approved vigilance was the moral imperative. And people, oftentimes, if they had more money, they were usually obtained by some criminal ways. Because when the government doesn't allow private enterprise and the opportunity to succeed materially, then the entrepreneurial people with ambitions, still find a way to succeed materially, to have a better living, to give a better living to their children, but they have to resort to illegal ways. And if everything is owned by the government, they can still create some sort of underground business, but they would have to steal the resources from the government and then to pay off a government official to cover it up. And so this corruption was spreading throughout the country, involving government officials too, because it would be impossible to have illegal businesses without government involvement. There was even, I remember, an occasion in the late 70s when in Georgia an entire underground car factory was discovered. That somebody, can you imagine the entrepreneurship of that guys and the goal of that guy that who in a totalitarian country created an underground car factory and being able to sell those cars. So there had to be a whole network, including the police, because the police need to register those cars to know where they're coming from. Of course, some of the parts could be manufactured there, but most, of course, were stolen from a Russian factory on the Volga River, transported to Georgia, and then assembled. Of course, they couldn't manufacture engines by themselves there on the, in the garage. But anyway, they were manufacturing cars. They were doing pretty well. The organizer of that business, I think, was jailed for 7 years of hard labor in Siberia. And I thought that if he lived in America, he would probably be one of the captains of industry. With the ability to organize business like that, and without any obstacles on part of the government, he would probably go very far. But unfortunately, he wound up in jail. That's where entrepreneurial people were heading under socialism. Eventually, even to be better off than another guy would be considered immoral. And what was moral was to be content with your poor condition and not wanting more, and just depending on what the government provides. That became the moral stance, and that was very uncommon in America before, but it's becoming more and more common, and I noticed that attitude. When I first came here, people mostly didn't talk about other people's income, but I noticed that journalists were, the liberal, progressive journalists were counting other people's money and deciding whether those actors or those politicians, athletes were worth those millions that they were getting. And I thought, why do you have to make it your business? It's not your business. They're succeeding, good for them. They're not stealing from me. It's people give that money to them voluntarily. But you notice how, so I thought that attitude was very un-American, and it was more like imported. It seemed very foreign. It shouldn't be in America. But I noticed that it was happening more and more often, and now with Occupy Wall Street and this claim we're the 99%, and then they described another part of the country, the 1%ers or the 2%ers. The whole notion of income and the fairness of income and whether anything is fair or not has become a household name now, a household topic of discussion. And that even the minimum wage, which we know where it leads to the loss of jobs for the teenagers and part-time housewives, it's also something that shouldn't be happening, but it's becoming a regular item now in American politics. What else I noticed that I didn't expect to find in America, but I did, was education. I expected American education to be much better than I found it, because I brought my children here, and I was hoping that they would be getting good education, and unfortunately that didn't happen. Once I came to a public school in Brooklyn, where I lived, and I was waiting needed to talk to the principal, and she was busy, so I waited for her in the hallway. And I noticed a billboard with the children's compositions painted to the billboard that were all titled, "How I Would Change the U.S. Constitution." There were just one or two paragraph little pieces written by 12-year-olds. And most of them, and I started reading, and I thought immediately, why would they need to do that, to change the U.S. Constitution? So I started reading, and I noticed that all of them included that we would like to have the right to free health care, the right to education, the right to work, the right to housing, all the other rights included into the U.S. Constitution. And then the principal came out, and she saw me reading that. She beamed. She thought, she said, "Aren't our children great, and how smart they are that they're doing this?" And I said, well, all those rights that they described were included in the Soviet Constitution, and that didn't do us anybody any good. And she said, why? Why is the right to health care, for instance, or for housing, or the right to work is bad? I said that because if that becomes a right, then the government will have to provide it for us, sometimes for free. And whatever, that would change the entire system and the relationship between the government and the citizen. And they would need to create an entirely different political system in order to be able to track everybody down and provide all those services. And whenever the government provides anything in bulk that loses, it becomes of inferior quality. And it becomes very expensive because we're still paying for it through our taxes. But in addition to what we're already paying, we'll also be supporting a large bureaucratic machine. And eventually we will wind up with an inferior service with different morals running the society and the different relationship between the government and the citizen, while right now we're free people who are deciding, choosing what service we want and paying for it out of our own pocket. We will stop being the owners of the country. We will become the subjects who will be expecting mercy from a bureaucrat and begging a bureaucrat to provide something for us, because the decision will ultimately be not between you and your provider, but between the decision will be that of the bureaucrat, who will choose between different people who deserves what and how much. Eventually, the American, well, the biblical principle, to each according to his deeds, that was running basically the idea of justice in the Judeo-Christian civilization, is now being replaced with this Marxist principle, to each according to his needs instead of deeds. And who determines the needs? How do you determine them? Who needs what? And so on. That was, oh yeah, and the principal then was unhappy with what I was saying. I said, why would the teachers put those ideas into the children's heads? She said, no, nobody was putting those ideas. The teachers didn't have any part in it. The children wrote about it out of the goodness of their hearts. And I said, yeah, I remember I was a 12-year-old once. And I remember the right to work or to education or healthcare wasn't anywhere on my horizon at the time. I know what I was thinking then. So don't tell me that these children came up with it themselves. And I thought that was just a separate Brooklyn school that was going that way. I didn't realize that it was the trend. Actually, the goal of the entire education system in the United States is now to indoctrinate the children in that manner, and that entire academic institutions are working to create the curriculum to that effect. And one of Obama's biggest supporters, Bill Ayers, was actually the one designing that curriculum. And it's not a conspiracy, because it's all happening in the open in the government, in the Department of Education, and with Common Core will know it's all part of that entire system. Now, there were quite a few other things I noticed, but perhaps I may not have enough time to talk about them. I just wanted to end with by saying that when I was talking to people in New York, and still not knowing what is going on, I was discovering the reality, the political and cultural reality of America all by myself. And I was asking very uncomfortable questions from people, and I started eventually to write them down, and here are some of these questions that I want to share with you. For example, let's see, regarding the environment, how come, did you notice that for the last 30 years we've been hearing that we have only 10 years left to save the planet? Why is a cloud of deadly gases over a volcano magnificent, but a smokestack over an American factory is ugly and harmful? And why is experimenting on animals cruel, but experimenting on human embryos is compassionate? And let's see. If being a winner in nature's struggle for survival is selfish, does being extinct make you an altruist? And why do progressives who hate modern civilization never live far from shopping centers or grind their coffee with a stone axe? And why do labor unions always demand equal pay for equal work, but never protest equal pay for little or no work? And if all opinions are equally valid, why are conservatives always wrong? Now, I have a lot more. We're short of time. Let's see. I wanted to end this with. We'll have Q&A later. I'll be happy to answer questions. But I want to say in the end that how do we oppose the left? How do we fight them? We need to, first of all, to understand what motivates them, that they have a very clear understanding that none of them think that what they're doing is evil. They're all doing it out of the good intentions. They're misguided, of course. They think that there is this, it is a great idea to create a world where populated by these ultimate collectivists, run by altruism, where people share everything, where all property is shared, will there be no war and always peace and love and understanding, which is a utopian idea, but they think that that idea is actually worth sacrificing for. And sometimes they are willing to sacrifice themselves, and sometimes they're willing to sacrifice us, other people, for it. As long as the end can be achieved, the end justifies the means. And then they sacrifice one person, they sacrifice two, then it's an entire class of people that needs to be sacrificed, then an entire ethnic group, and then some entire nation. And that happened in history before, and there is no end to it. There will be no end to sacrifice, no end to the moral degradation of the society as they're trying to implement their ideas. So I say that keeping this economic inequality the way it is a small price to pay to remain normal human beings, living in a free world, in a moral society, and maintaining normal relations between people. Now, if we have time, I can comment a little bit on the situation in the Caucasus region in the former USSR, Chechnya, Dagestan, where the Tsarnaev brothers are from, just to give you a little more background of what is happening there and why people are doing what they're doing. Do we have? Okay. When the Russian Empire was growing, especially the most rapid growth was in the 18th and 19th century, there was also a concept similar to what you had in the United States called the manifest destiny. It wasn't called the manifest destiny in Russia, but still it was similar. It it was expanding in part because it was bordering on Muslim and almost often nomadic nations who were, in whose nature it was to be at war with the neighbors, to loot the neighbors, and to take captives and slaves. So whenever Russia expanded to new territories, there was always a conflict with a neighboring Muslim nation who would invade, who would make forays and capture slaves and steal property. So they needed to pacify that group and bring them to order and discipline them. And then the next group behind them would do exactly the same thing. So the empire kept expanding to also take over that territory and pacify them and civilize them. They were not just killing or exterminating people. They were bringing schools, education, some kind of industry, culture to those areas. So in some ways it was beneficial to those countries, to those areas, but it also was hurting Russia by, in a way that all empires suffer their expansion. See what's happening to the British Empire right now, that all the former residents of the colonies are now gathering on a small island in Britain, and now there is the most popular children's name in Britain is Muhammad, because of all the Pakistanis that have moved there. So a similar thing happened in Russia. The influence of those people, especially the Muslim nations who were moving into proper Russia, was growing. Now, some of those nations were the Caucasus nation. Caucasus mountains are what you would call Balkanized. You know, the Balkans are Balkanized because there are mountain regions, and every valley has its own group with its own culture. Not so much in the Balkans, but still, the division between people based on their territory, ethnic group, and religion, it received this name, Balkanization. But Caucasus would be a much better example of that, because those people have almost in the North Caucasus, almost every valley has its own people with its own language. And the structure of the Russian Federation is such that there are certain so-called autonomous republics within the Russian borders. They have their own administrative system, and they're based on ethnic territory and ethnic group living inside of it. So there is a Tatar Autonomous Republic, there is Dagestan Autonomous Republic, Chechen Autonomous Republic. They're part of the Russian Federation, but the people who live there are not Russians. Some Russians live there, but mostly they're the local ethnic group. And oftentimes they're not just different from the Russians, they're incompatible. And oftentimes the militant Muslim groups living in North Caucasus are incompatible with the general Russian population. I had some contacts with them when I lived there. I even had a fist fight with one of them when I was younger, with a Chechen. Why he hated the Russians was because the Russians gave too much power to women, because women weren't supposed to run the family or keep the husband's money. The Russians were all drunks and let their women run over them. And that's why he had no respect for the Russians, and of course no respect for the women. Then what happened under the USSR is that the oppression, the political oppression, was so strong that even a hint of any kind of nationalism was suppressed, and people would be sent to the Gulag. And for a while that pacified the country, and all those differences were forgotten. Previously, the North Caucasus was taken over by Russia mostly after the war with Turkey at sometime in the middle of the 19th century. Prior to that, the Chechen nation, for instance, their main source of income was the loot that they would take from their neighbors. Usually the women were the ones who worked in the house and in the fields. The men were the one riding horses, and they would ride horses to another valley across the mountain and take away their property and bring them back. Take slaves. Slavery existed all the way until the end of the 19th century in those places. And now it's been restored. When during the war with Russia, they would take Russian soldiers and keep them as slaves and hold them in the cellars. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the oppression ended, and some of those nations wanted independence, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there were, of course, the terms in which that independence could be granted. And if Chechnya was inside the Russian territory, on all sides was surrounded by Russia, it was very difficult to be completely independent, like surrounded by a fence, for instance. A war started, and there were also grievances that the Chechen had against Stalin, who exiled the entire nation when the war with the Germans started, because the Chechens were sympathetic of the Nazis. So he sent out the entire nation to Siberia, and then they were able to return back home only in the 50s. Of course, that made a lot of them angry. Now, the war with Russia ended, the first war in the early 90s ended with the Chechens getting de facto independence. They could do whatever they wanted inside their own country. It ended with them restoring the Muslim religion, first of all, then the Saudi clerics coming in, bringing the millions of the petrodollars and building mosques and madrasas and converting the population and the children of Chechnya to the jihadis and the martyrs, the mujahideen. Chechnya became the Russian version of Afghanistan, of the Taliban. It was basically a Taliban. And eventually, the second war with Chechnya started when the Chechens invaded the Dagestan territory. It's another neighboring autonomous republic, were populated by Muslims too. The goal of those Muslim jihadis in Russia, why they're fighting, is they want all the Muslim lands inside Russia, and that's a pretty large territory, to be run by the Muslims, to go back to the Muslim rule, to be operated under Sharia, and independent from the kufir, from the unbelievers. And of course the Russian government wouldn't allow that, and the conflict continues. The Dagestan, where the brothers are from, actually they're not exactly completely Chechen. That's how they're presented. First of all, there's a lot of misperception with them. If they spoke Russian, that doesn't mean they were Russians. A lot of people, a lot of Americans think they were Russians. It's far from the truth, they were not. Second, the father was Chechen, the mother was Avar, which is the main nation ethnic group in Dagestan, the neighboring Dagestan. That's why they lived in the capital of Dagestan, Makhachkala. And that's where the parents are now. Why I'm mentioning the ethnicity, for us it doesn't matter. In America, that's what I like about America. Nobody cares what ethnic background you are, as long as you have the right head, your right ideas. It doesn't matter who your father or your mother is. In those parts of the world, it matters very much. Blood is sometimes more important than anything else. It's the ultimate collectivist mindset. You are part of the family, of the clan. If your relative was hurt by somebody, you need to take revenge. If your uncle kills somebody in another clan, that clan goes after your uncle and kills them, you think you had your ideas about about going to college. Maybe you wanted to have a family, to build a house. Forget about all that. You have to drop everything, hunt down the guy who killed your uncle and kill him. And then spend the rest of your life on the run, being hunted down by the people, the relatives of the guy that you killed. And that was the lifestyle that lasted for centuries, for thousands of years. And they were these ethnic hatreds and strifes and clan against clan for hundreds of years. It's all coming back now. Now, what unites them all is Islam and the common jihad. I have watched quite a few videos from those parts. The videos produced by those jihadis are usually, they try to speak Russian, or at least they have Russian subtitles. That is done because all these different small ethnic Muslim groups would not be able to understand each other otherwise. They are united by the belief in Allah, but not the language. So they all have to communicate in Russian between them. In Dagestan alone, there are dozens of different ethnic groups and different languages belonging to different linguistic families. They're not even remotely related to each other. So you can imagine living there, and oftentimes people living there speak several languages. And you have to give credit to those guys. I was following the events with the Tsarnaev brothers. Some of the correspondence by this Tsarnaev brother, the elder one, was published, and I also saw his Facebook account. Not Facebook, it was a Russian version of Facebook. He wrote pretty standard, good Russian language with good grammar. He also spoke English, apparently. He had an American wife. He apparently also spoke Chechen of his father, and he spoke the Avar of his mother, because that's where they lived in Makhachkala. So the multilingual aspect is always present there. Of course, oftentimes, none of those languages is spoken fluently. It's just the pidgin variety of each. So that's in brief. I can go on a little more, and maybe when I answer questions, if you have questions.
Just one quick question.
Yes.
Why did Chechnya invade Dagestan?
It was.
Can you repeat that question?
Why did Chechnya invade Dagestan? You mentioned that they did.
Yes. The idea that Chechnya was run by an organization similar to the Taliban. And their goal was to liberate not just Chechnya anymore, but the entire Muslim population who were, in their view, suffering from the Russian oppression. From not just Russian, it was the oppression of the non-believers, because Christians or whoever else was running the country, they were not Muslims. The Muslims cannot be under any one other rules, under the rule of any other religion. They need to be the dominant religion. That was how Muhammad said it should be, and so that's what they're fighting for. So the invasion to Dagestan was just step one in a major campaign to create insurgencies throughout Russia, in every place where the Muslims lived, and have this big holy war against the non-believers. I don't think they actually believe that they may get independence. The point here is to wage war, jihad, and to die as martyr, and have this righteous way of life for the Muslims. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. How do you see Putin as the main person in Russia today?
How do I see Putin as the Russian leader?
Yeah.
He's a very complex character, and he has done some good things and bad things. One of the good things is that he kind of brought Russia back out of the wave of criminality that existed, that everything was run by the mafia. There were gang wars. No business was able to operate without paying some kind of tribute to some kind of mobsters. Even the oligarchs were in alliance with mobsters. It was mob rule everywhere. So what he did was the former KGB, to which he is still connected, it is now called the FSB, they changed the name, was employed to fight the economic corruption and the mafia, the mob. What happened is that oftentimes those FSB guys took the disjointed mob groups under their wing and gave them the roof. So the FSB became the roof, the big mafia roof. So instead of having all these mafia wars, they created one big mafia with just one roof, so that the payoffs go to just in one source instead of many. So, but at least it's peaceful now, and the mob wars are history. The way he runs the country is very corrupt. He, of course, falsifies elections and appoints his governor. He changed the rules. Instead of people electing their governors, now all the governors are appointed from Moscow by him. The main source of income for Russia is oil now. The most industries aren't working anymore. Russia was kind of not very efficient, but it was kind of self-sufficient in the sense that living isolated from the rest of the world, it had to manufacture every single item that people may need inside the country. There were some imports, but most of the stuff was Soviet-made. Not anymore. With all the goods coming from China and the better goods, the more luxury goods coming from the West, the Russian industries just can't survive the competition. The factories close, people are without work, but Putin is lucky because oil prices are going up. There is a lot of oil in Siberia, and if you see Lukoil gas stations around here, Lukoil, I don't see many of them here, but there are lots of them in the northeast. That's the Russian oil company from Siberia, where I lived for 3 years. That's where it's from. That's where the oil is. And Putin was just lucky. They have a surplus, a budget surplus, unlike us. But that's because the oil prices are going up, and they are exporting it like crazy, and the gas too. And so what he does is he appoints somebody he finds convenient for his political rule. There is a hole in the pipeline. He puts a guy to manage that hole. You can pump as much oil for yourself as you want, as long as you send a certain percentage to the right place eventually. Yes, please.
You would mention something about the Saudi Arabia helping Chechnya.
Yes.
I'm always wondering about this, the two brothers, if there's more people is this more like a worldwide thing? They're probably very well organized. I mean, you have the Muslims in Chechnya.
Right.
And then you've got, Afghanistan, you've got Iran.
Right.
Are they kind of organized? Because the Saudi Arabian connection kind of bothers me.
Yes, the Saudis provide the money and the ideology, the Wahhabist ideology. Maybe some organizing experience, but most of it is local, and there are a lot of local groups that are kind of trying to unite, but it's hard to keep it all in a big organization, especially if you're fighting against the Russian intelligence, because the Russians also have their anti-terrorist forces.
And one more thing. Could we get more information on your website on this Chechnya connection?
I haven't written about that yet, maybe later, but there is a lot of information there. I just thought that there is so much being written that I'll just be redundant if I start repeating that. So let me just mention one other thing. I was with regards to the radicalization of the Tsarnaev brothers, is that while the people in Chechnya are blaming America for what happened, they are right not in the way they think they are, but in the sense that they went to school here, but the public education that they were getting did not provide them with the cognitive tools to understand what is going to like this country, to appreciate this political system. They were not encouraged to assimilate. The multiculturalist attitude that is being taught in school told them that they need to stay separate, that they live in their own ethnic enclave. The welfare system also kept them down because their entire family probably never worked a day in their lives, and they were always on welfare. Well, if they did work, it was under the table for cash, as a lot of Russian immigrants that I see, so in Brooklyn did. They were living in a subsidized apartment, receiving welfare, and working under the table
So
for
Mother
cash.
was doing facials in her apartment.
Yeah, they don't just do nothing. I mean, they do stuff, but oftentimes that stuff is under the table for cash. So those people, I mean, there are a lot of, the list goes on and why they turned this way, because a lot of even American kids from American parents turn up not right in their heads because of the kind of education and the attitude they're getting. Yes.
It's been reported lately that the government is buying up an inordinate amount of ammunition. And I'm just curious if you see that from your experience as a sign that if they were coming closer to the tipping point of no return from socialism, and what other signs we should be on the lookout for.
That part I cannot comment on. I don't have enough knowledge. I mean, I read the same sources that you do. I just don't know more.
I mean, in Russia, for example, I guess guns were not really ever a big issue, but
right. They were not an issue because nobody had them.
But what signs should we be looking for? How close are we? Are we coming to the tipping point of no return?
Okay, here is what I can say about the signs. There are similarities, but they mostly in trends, but not in the details. The details cannot be the same because when the left is fighting for power, it uses one strategy. When it already has taken the power and holds it, it uses a completely different strategy and a different set of rules. For example, here is the quote from Nikolai Bukharin, who used to be Lenin's closest ally and eventually was accused by Stalin and of murder and run through a show trial, but that was later. Before, he was one of the organizers of the revolution and then the editor-in-chief of the communist newspaper Pravda. He said in 1917, right after the revolution, that we needed those, before the revolution we were arguing for freedom of the press, for all the civil liberties, because we needed to weaken the country and conquer it. Now that we have conquered, we have no need for those civil liberties. So they discarded immediately with the freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and all the other civil liberties. That's what the difference, there is a difference between in the strategy of the army that is in defense and an army that is in offense. If they position their resources differently, they organize their people differently, and so when the left right now is in the offense, it acts according to one particular strategy. When it takes over, when it protects what it has already gained in the USSR, it used a different one. Let me read quickly some of my notes. In the USSR, the left owned the country, and so it was protecting its own system. There was no tolerance for the moral and mental decadence. You wouldn't last long in the USSR if you were to try to promote pacifism or multiculturalism, or breaking up the society into minority pressure groups, or the destruction of the family, or cultivating the sense of unearned entitlements, or legalization of drugs, or gays in the military, or New Age religions, or flags of other countries, other nations, waving them during rallies, or a union strike. Union strikes were not allowed either. There was no depravity in the media or on TV. There were no frivolous lawsuits. Nobody had the right to sue the government for millions of dollars in punitive damages. There was no ACLU. All these things that the left is trying to promote. There was no concept of clobber and pivot, that the destruction of the country by or taxing the federal and state budgets. All of that would be quickly disposed of. Nothing of that, none of that was allowed. No open borders, of course, because the border was very tightly closed. There were minefields. You would be blown up if you tried to cross it. And
But wasn't that to protect the foreigners who come in? Wasn't that how they?
protect the foreigner, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So everything that the left is currently promoting in this country, it's doing here because it needs to destroy it. It needs to remove the system and then on the ruins to start building their own system. And once they build it, they will change the strategy. There will be no more talk of all this tolerance, no more talk about open borders, whatever this is needed. For instance, right now they need open borders. The more Mexicans come in, the more they apply for social services, the better the clobber-pivot strategy works. Without that, I mean, once they are in power, they need to take care of the budget. They will have to stop all that. They will have to, if they need to regulate the workforce, they will eventually stop the free movement of people. Like in the USSR, there was no free movement of people. You could not just leave and go to another city unless you had a special work invitation or a certain family arrangement, like you married somebody in another city. You could move. Otherwise, you were like a serf living in a farm without the right to change your location.
You know, Oleg, really, I don't think you get in on a better note than that.
I'd
I'd like to see you sell some books, so I don't want people to run out when we're finished. But I don't mean to cut you off, but we have a time that we're doing. But I really think that you could not end on a better note than that, because that is so clearly put in a way that I never really thought about, that they would change tactics. I mean, I think that you made an excellent point there. So we really want to thank you for coming today. And